Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of the WOW History Channel. I'm your host Ron Guth, and this week we continue with part 2 of the biography of George Washington from the 1858 book, The National Portrait Gallery of Distinguished Americans. The engraving you see here is from the same book and shows Washington in his general's uniform. It was adapted from a larger painting by the famous artist Colonel John Trumbull, which showed a full-length portrait of Washington standing in front of his horse. This engraving is a perfect illustration of how history sometimes gives us only part of the whole picture. Do you want to see just Washington's head, or do you want the complete picture and all the associated elements? In any event, part 1 of this series ended with Washington being named commander of the American armies. That's where the real fun begins, because now Washington has the support of the colonies, united in their opposition to the British. Just to give you context, Washington was appointed commander-in-chief in 1774, so we'll pick up as he starts to prepare for battle. As in part 1, I'll throw in an occasional editorial comment, but I'll make it clear what's editorial and what's text. So, here begins the text for part 2 of George Washington's biography from 1858. Quote, "He proceeded to Cambridge, near Boston, without delay, and entered on the arduous duties of his station about the 1st of July, 1775. At this time, the British Army, under General Howe, was entrenched in 2 divisions at Roxbury Neck and Bunker Hill. The Americans were encamped on the numerous hills around Boston, their right extending towards Dorchester, their left covered by the Medford River. The commander-in-chief found himself at the head of about 14,500 men, variously armed, without cannon, and with few bayonets and but a small supply of powder. The officers, with few exceptions, without experience, and soldiers without discipline. All these defects were to be remedied before offensive operations could commence. The emergency required all the firmness, industry, and perseverance of Washington, and although he was indefatigable in his exertions, the organization of the army and the collecting of munitions occupied the remainder of the summer and the following autumn. In the meantime, the British Army was closely blockaded in Boston, and although it suffered much for supplies, remained inactive. Towards the close of the year, a new subject of anxiety arose. The time of service of the troops would expire with a year, and the army was to be replaced by another in the presence of a disciplined enemy. To raise another army, even for 1 year's service, was attended with many difficulties. The enthusiastic ardor which had brought the first force into the field had abated. The recollections of home had revived sweet visions of domestic comfort, and the wish to revisit relatives and friends often prevailed over a sense of duty. As the year declined, the army gradually melted away, and at the beginning of 1776, the new enlistments scarcely equaled the number of the British troops in Boston. Still, the public, themselves deceived as well as the enemy by the exaggerated representations of Washington's offensive means, were impatiently looking for active measures. The commander was not insensible to the effects of his apparent inactivity on the public mind, but it would have been ruin to have explained the cause. He was determined to expel the enemy from Boston as soon as a favorable opportunity should present, and his views being known to Congress, that body authorized him to make an attack, quote, in any way he might think expedient, notwithstanding the town and property in it might be thereby destroyed, end quote. The general assured Congress that an attempt would be made the first moment he should perceive a probability of success, and prayed them to believe that circumstances, not inclination on his part, occasioned the delay. Quote, "It is not," said he, "in the pages of history to furnish a case like ours. To maintain a post within musket shot of the enemy for 6 months, together without ammunition, and at the same time to disband one army and recruit another within that distance of 20-odd British regiments, is more than probably was ever attempted. But if we succeed as well in the latter as we have hitherto done in the former, I shall think it the most fortunate event in my whole life." End quote. About the middle of February, the general summoned a council and submitted the subject of attacking the enemy in Boston by marching over the ice, which was then firm enough to bear the troops, but they gave, with regret, nearly an unanimous opinion against it. At length, having received a small additional supply of powder, he determined to fortify Dorchester Heights, which would compel the enemy to fight or abandon the town. He detached a sufficient force in the night of the 4th of March to take possession. Before morning, the breastwork was formed and the cannon mounted. When the morning light revealed the new entrenchment to the British, they opened a fire upon it, which was promptly returned. Lord Percy was then ordered, with about 3,000 men, to dislodge the Americans, but they were delayed by a storm until the works were so strengthened that it was deemed advisable to let them alone. General Howe then prepared to evacuate Boston, and Washington, confidently believing that New York would be the next point of attack, detached a part of the army towards that place, whilst he continued to make approaches toward Boston with the remaining troops. The British evacuated the town on the 17th of March, and in a few days left the harbor. Washington, with the main body of his army, arrived in New York on the 14th of April and pressed forward the defenses of the city. Many of the inhabitants of New York were disaffected to the American cause, and to add to the embarrassments the commander-in-chief already experienced, a part of his own guard was seduced to seize his person and deliver him to the enemy, but the plot being discovered, some of the conspirators were executed. Early in July, the British Army landed on Staten Island, 8 miles below the city of New York, where they remained about 3 weeks and received large reinforcements of German troops. They then passed over the Narrows to Long Island and pushed their detachments across the country through flatlands toward the Sound. These being opposed by a division under Generals Sullivan and Lord Stirling, a severe contest ensued, but the British right having outflanked the left of the Americans, the latter suffered a total defeat and took shelter within the lines at Brooklyn, which the enemy immediately invested and prepared to assault, believing them to be more formidable than they really were. Washington had seen the latter part of this battle, and unwilling to hazard the loss of that whole division, he determined to withdraw it. This he effected in the night after the battle with such secrecy and dispatch that the enemy were first aware of the retreat when they perceived the near guard crossing the East River in the morning. From the commencement of the action on the 27th until the last boat left Brooklyn on the morning of the 29th, Washington was without rest or sleep and was most of the time on horseback. The British army were within musket shot of the lines, yet such was the silence and order preserved that 9,000 men, with their arms and ammunition and most of the provisions and cannon, were conveyed across a river half a mile broad without confusion or interruption. This skillful execution of this masterly retreat has been extolled by all writers on the subject. It now became necessary to evacuate New York, and after a short stand at Kingsbridge, the American army took a position at White Plains. Here a battle was fought which was not decisive, and while General Howe was waiting for a reinforcement, Washington took another position which the British commander considered too strong to be attempted, and after endeavoring in vain to draw on an engagement on more favorable terms, he changed his plan of operations, marched down the Hudson, and captured Fort Washington on York Island, making about 2,000 prisoners. This was a serious blow to the American cause and rendered an immediate retreat across the river imperative. Lord Cornwallis, with a large force, followed so close in the rear of the feeble remnant of an army which accompanied Washington into New Jersey that Fort Lee on that side of the river was hastily abandoned, and with it nearly all the artillery and baggage. It was now late in November. Most of the New England militia had returned home, their term of service having expired. On the 1st of December, the Maryland and New Jersey levies availed themselves of the same right at Brunswick, even while the enemy were in sight. The loss of their baggage, sickness, and fatigue rendered them impatient and for a time overcame every other consideration. The Continental troops wasted daily by disease and desertion until the Grand Army, on which hung the destinies of this continent, was reduced to 3,000 men, without tents or camp equipage, half naked and barefooted, disheartened by misfortunes and even hope afar off. The spirit of the commander, sustained by the resolution and firmness of his officers, carried him through this scene of suffering with a countenance of calm self-possession, which saved the army from immediate dissolution. On the 8th of December he crossed the Delaware and secured all the boats to prevent the passage of the enemy. The British army entered Trenton as the last boat of the Americans left. There General Howe abandoned the pursuit until the ice should bridge the river. Meanwhile, he cantoned his army in detachments in the towns along the left bank of the Delaware and at Trenton and New Brunswick. Washington, whilst gathering strength by calling in the distant divisions and volunteers, with secret exultation watched the detached corps of the British and Hessians, and he concerted with Generals Cadwalader and Irving a simultaneous attack on 3 of them. That which was conducted by the commander-in-chief was alone successful. His troops began to cross the Delaware a few miles above Trenton about dusk on the 25th of December, when it was believed the enemy would be enjoying the festive anniversary in confidence of safety. The night was dark and very cold, and the passage was so retarded by a high wind, a swift current, and masses of floating ice that it was 4 o'clock in the morning before they could be formed on the Jersey shore. The attack was made in 2 columns about daybreak, a violent snowstorm driving directly in the faces of the assailants at the time. The enemy made a momentary show of resistance by a wild and ill-directed fire from their quarters and attempted to form on the main street, which was prevented by the fire of 6 pieces of artillery. Quote, "When Forrest's battery was opened," says General Wilkinson, "the general kept on the left, and advancing with it, giving objects of direction to his fire, his position was an exposed one, and he was frequently entreated to fall back, on which he took no notice. He had turned the guns on the retreating enemy, when to an order for the discharge of canister, Captain Forrest observed, 'Sir, they have struck.' 'Struck?' replied the general. 'Yes,' said Forrest, 'their colors are down.' 'So they are,' observed the chief, and galloped towards them." End quote. A troop of British dragoons and about 500 infantry fled down the river. The main body, after endeavoring to escape by the right towards Princeton, surrendered on a summons from the general. The killed and wounded of the Americans amounted to only 10. The Hessian Colonel Rall, with 6 other officers and about 40 men, were killed, and 23 officers and nearly 1,000 men made prisoners, with their arms and accoutrements, cannon, etc., all which were safely conveyed across the Delaware. I'm going to add an editorial comment here. If you're familiar with the painting of Washington crossing the Delaware, you'll recall the scene where Washington is standing in the boat with his men, and they're crossing through a river that is full of ice and flows of ice. And this was just his genius move to attack the British and Hessians while they were celebrating Christmas on Trenton. They never expected it, and it was a complete surprise, and of course it was a great success for Washington. Now back to the text. This achievement changed the aspect of the war, raised the desponding spirits of the people, and inspired the army with renewed zeal. The prisoners having been disposed of, Washington returned to Trenton. Cornwallis, with an army whose strength gave him a confidence of victory, approached on the afternoon of the 2nd of January, 1777, and was met with firmness by detachments of Americans who disputed his approach with great gallantry, but whose only object was to wear away the day without the risk of a general engagement. The watchfires were lighted, guards doubled, a fatigue party set to work on an entrenchment within hearing of the enemy's sentinels, and every appearance kept up of a determination to abide the result of a battle on the morrow. But at midnight, Washington moved his little army by an indirect route towards Princeton, where was posted a large detachment of British troops. This maneuver was not discovered by the enemy until morning, when the firing at Princeton announced that the American army was 9 miles in their rear and their magazines at Brunswick in danger of destruction. Early on the morning of the 3rd, the advance of the American army encountered the 17th British Regiment near Princeton, and after a short action gave way. Washington now formed his troops into a close column, and placing himself at their head, he led them into action. The struggle was short, but fierce and obstinate. The 17th Regiment was nearly annihilated. 2 other British regiments threw themselves into the college, which they soon abandoned, and made a precipitate retreat towards Brunswick with very little loss. They were followed as far as Kingston, and it was the desire of every officer to strike at the enemy's post at New Brunswick, but the men were too much exhausted by hunger, cold, and fatigue to warrant the attempt. Besides which, the enemy from Trenton were exchanging shot with the rear guard. The army was, therefore, conducted by way of Rocky Hill and Somerville to Morristown, where they went into winter quarters. Here, with never more, but often less than 1,000 regulars and about 2,000 militia, Washington kept the enemy in check, although they occupied their line of posts from Brunswick to New York with 25,000 men. Here's another editorial note. You'll notice by Washington's actions here that the Army was really trying to avoid a big battle with the British, in which they probably would have lost. So a lot of Washington's maneuvers were to avoid the British, to engage them when they could, and basically to keep them in check. So we see from this narrative here that the British had 25,000 men on this line from Brunswick to New York, and Washington, with about 3,000 men, was able to keep them in check during the winter. So that's quite an accomplishment that kept the American hopes alive for the spirit of independence. Now back to the text. But the spirit of the citizens of New Jersey was now roused to exertion, not only by the successes of their countrymen, but also by the insults, injuries, and cruelty of the foe, particularly the Hessian troops who had overrun the middle counties of that state. Taught by the bitter experience of the, quote, protection, end quote, afforded by that licentious soldiery, the militia of New Jersey watched every opportunity to strike the enemy wherever their foraging or reconnoitering parties appeared, and their frequent success greatly relieved the commander-in-chief, who again had to encounter the evils arising from short enlistments. He had often remonstrated with Congress about the practice of engaging men for a single year, but the prejudices of the country against a standing army was difficult to overcome. Relying, however, on the integrity and wisdom of the commander, he was, 2 days after the Battle of Trenton, invested with full powers to raise 16 battalions of infantry, 3,000 cavalry, 3 regiments of artillery, and a corps of engineer, to establish their pay, form magazines, appoint and displace officers under the rank of brigadier generals at his pleasure, and to take whatever he might want, wherever he might be, for the use of the army. In short, so far as the army was concerned, his powers were almost dictatorial for the period of 6 months. After the British forces had obtained possession of New York, their next object had been Philadelphia. In this they had been hitherto effectually baffled. In the spring of 1777 the attempt was renewed, but all their maneuvers to withdraw the American army from their advantageous position in the hills were ineffectual, and after some trials of skill between the hostile commanders, the British resorted to their ships. They embarked from New York in July, and entering the Chesapeake, landed at the head of Elk on the 25th of August and marched towards Philadelphia. At the Brandywine, Washington opposed their progress on the 10th of September, but was compelled to retire with considerable loss. On the 16th, Washington once more determined to risk an engagement to save Philadelphia, but a storm of unusual violence obliged him to retire, as is stated in our sketch on the life of General Wayne, who commanded the attack. On the 25th of the same month, the British general took possession of Philadelphia and soon after formed an encampment at Germantown. For the particulars of the battle which was fought there, we refer, for the sake of avoiding unnecessary repetition, to the life of Colonel Howard. The British forces being concentrated in Philadelphia, and their ships, after some gallant resistance, having obtained command of the Delaware, Washington took a strong position at White Marsh. Sir William Howe, although in command of a vastly superior force, found himself so much restricted by the proximity of the American army, which shut him out from a rich and to him necessary country for supplies, that he marched out to attack it, hoping to take it by surprise, but he was foiled in his attempt and returned to Philadelphia. Determined to defend the country from depredation, Washington selected Valley Forge for winter quarters. Here, while the foe were luxuriating in the comfortable quarters of a populous and wealthy city, the Americans were sheltered in huts of their own fabrication, and frequently suffered the extremity of want. The commissary's department, imperfectly organized for want of experience, had given cause for frequent complaints. Congress, by endeavoring to apply a remedy, increased the distress of the troops, so that very frequently their movements were prevented and the plans of the commander consequently embarrassed. He frequently and earnestly remonstrated, but the evil was not, and indeed could not be immediately obviated without causing much distress in other quarters. Congress authorized the seizure of provisions within 70 miles of headquarters, and although Washington was compelled by the necessities of his army to avail himself of the authority, he exercised it with so much reluctance and forbearance that the wants of the troops were scarcely satisfied, and Congress appeared as much dissatisfied with his lenity to the people as the inhabitants were by what they considered a rigorous exercise of power. At this time a party was formed in Congress to remove the commander-in-chief. A few officers of the army encouraged the discontents, by comparing the services of Washington with those of General Gates, forgetting in their zeal the fact that the one had repeatedly fought a superior force, and that the other, though a conqueror, had gained his laurels with an army, regulars, and militia of nearly 3 times the numerical strength of his opponents. The legislature of Pennsylvania, too, added their voice to the dissension by remonstrating against the army removing into winter quarters. But the machinations of faction were vain. The commander possessed the confidence of the country and was beloved by the army, and even the troops who had served under General Gates expressed their indignation at the idea of a change. The only effect produced in the country was a universal excitement of resentment against those who were believed to be inimical to the chief. While these combinations of intrigue and ambition were progressing, the sufferings of the army were not ameliorated, and they at length drew from the commander a communication to Congress of unprecedented plainness and energy. He stated his conviction that unless some great change took place in the commissaries department, the army would inevitably be reduced to starvation or dissolution, that there was not in the camp a single head of cattle to be slaughtered, and not more than 25 barrels of flour, nor could the commissary tell when any might be expected, and that 3 or 4 days of bad weather would prove their destruction, that there were nearly 3,000 men in camp unfit for duty, because they were barefooted and otherwise naked, besides those confined in the hospitals and to farmhouses on the same account. He charged it home to those who had remonstrated against his going into winter quarters that they knew the nakedness of the troops from ocular demonstration. Quote, "I can assure those gentlemen," said he, "that it is much easier and less distressing to draw remonstrances in a comfortable room by a good fireside than to occupy a cold, bleak hill and sleep under frost and snow without clothes or blankets." Quote, "I can assure those gentlemen," said he, "that it is much easier and less distressing to draw remonstrances in a comfortable room by a good fireside than to occupy a cold, bleak hill and sleep under frost and snow without clothes or blankets. However, although they seem to have little feeling for the naked and distressed soldiers, I feel superabundantly for them, and from my soul pity those miseries which it is not in my power either to relieve or prevent." End quote. Here's an editorial comment. This is the famous encampment at Valley Forge that we've read about and heard about so often, where the soldiers suffered extreme depredations in the winter, snow, cold, frostbite, but Washington was right there with them, and that is one of the reasons why he was so beloved by his troops. And now back to the text. The exertions which were made by Congress and the state governments at length afforded relief, but in the meantime the army was supported only by the impressments of its detachment. As the spring approached, unwearied diligence was used to prepare for the ensuing campaign. The troops received instruction from the Baron Steuben, a Prussian officer of great merit, and every possible effort was made to establish order, regularity, and discipline. Early in May 1778, the intelligence was received that France had recognized the independence of the United States by treaty, and the additional information that although war between France and Great Britain had not been formally declared, it had commenced in fact. It was soon after known that a naval force, which had been preparing in the French ports in anticipation of this event, was to act on the American waters. This rendered Philadelphia an unsafe position to the British Army, and Sir Henry Clinton, who about this time assumed the command, made immediate preparation to evacuate it. Clinton crossed the Delaware on the 18th of June and slowly retired through New Jersey. Washington put his army in motion and crossed the river a few miles above and advanced on a line parallel to his adversary, with whom he was earnestly desirous to close, but in this he was opposed by the advice of his general officer. When, however, the enemy reached Monmouth Courthouse, the spirit of enterprise which had been so long restrained determined him not to let the opportunity pass of once more striking at the foe. He accordingly took measures to draw on an engagement, and the Battle of Monmouth was fought on the 28th of June. After a keenly contested action, both armies, overpowered by fatigue and the excessive heat of the day, suspended the combat on the approach of evening as by mutual consent. Washington, wrapped in his cloak, lay that night on the field in the midst of his soldiers, ready to renew the battle in the morning, but the enemy, under cover of the night, retired in silence, leaving 249 of their dead on the field. The British Army embarked at Sandy Hook and sailed to New York, and the Americans once more took a position on the banks of the Hudson. Here's the final editorial comment for today's episode. This is a good point at which to take a break in the text because between 1778 and 1780, Washington was not involved in any actions against the British. Instead, he did his very best to keep his army together. As the old enlistments went home, he had to raise a new army each year. Another thing that was occurring at this time was that the American public perceived that because the French had joined the Americans in the battle against Great Britain, that the war would soon be over. As a result, public enthusiasm for the war began to diminish in the hopes that Great Britain would be induced to enter a treaty with France and end the war in America. But of course that never happened. This made it even more difficult for Washington to raise troops and money, and so we enter a dark period in American history. Thank you very much for listening to this episode. I hope you're learning something about George Washington that's different from the biographies you've read before. If you like this channel, please consider subscribing, and I would appreciate any comments in the section below. Please let me know if you're learning something new, and rest assured that I will answer any comment that's posted below. So again, thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you in the next episode, which will be part 3 of the George Washington biography from 1858. Thank you, and see you next time. Bye-bye.